I'm one of the directors of the OT service. The OT service provides Closomat with clinical support, clinical consultancy. So nothing in this presentation is product focused, which is great. It's all very much about delivering something that you can then explore in more depth at your leisure. The half an hour isn't a lot of time to get into figures in a great amount of detail, which you're probably all greatly relieved about, but it's an oversight into what I think is a really interesting concept for you to then go in and reflect on in a bit more depth. The idea of the session is to start to really challenge what we term expensive and high cost, and whether or not we consider what return on investment we get from making recommendations for items we would otherwise consider to be high cost. It's all right me saying that and providing you with figures, but it's really important that I back that up with some kind of robust evidence base. So if you're then presenting that, it can really support your clinical reasoning process. As an OT myself, I completely understand that, and that's why I've started to build in some concepts of where the evidence comes from today. So a rhetorical question, clearly, but what does expensive mean to you? That's where we're going to start. Some of the potential answers you might get would be, it just costs a lot of money. So we all have a different idea of what that value is for a product. Some of us might think £20 is expensive, while the person sitting next to you thinks £1,000 is what we class as expensive. So it's very subjective. Or you might also say it's more than the competitor. So you might have two products side by side, and the one that you deem expensive is the one that literally has the highest figure attached to it. So what's your response to what you might consider to be high cost? Let's take this exhibition, for example. How many times today or tomorrow or in any other exhibition you're at, will you walk past a stand and think, that costs too much for me to have a particular interest in? How many times will you walk past a stand and think, it's interesting, I really like it, but there's absolutely no way, given where I work, that that's going to be approved? How many of you will walk past a stand and think an item is based on luxury rather than what might be identified as clinical need? I'm asking those questions because they're all things that I've thought and done. I've walked past stands and thought exactly those things. So I'd be surprised if there was nobody sitting in front of me who's had those same thoughts and just kept on walking. But how many of us have walked past the stand and thought, I wonder how cost effective it is? That's a completely different question. And to explore cost effectiveness, we need to know, one, what does that mean? And then start to explore what return on investment means. So cost effective, it's a couple of definitions there, is the ability to give the best possible profit or benefit in comparison with the money spent. So no longer are we thinking it's about the actual spend, it's about the comparison of the money spent versus what do we get back from it. And gaining the greatest possible return when choosing from a range of investment options. Now that second one is a banking definition, but I've put it in there because I think it transfers quite nicely. Our investment options are the recommendations that we're making. Essentially, we're creating a list of recommendations, or not. It might just be the one where we're saying this is the investment option. So cost effective would be what return, getting the greatest possible return from that investment option. What's really interesting then is that how many of us know what the evidence says about how we start to determine cost effectiveness for our own recommendations. I certainly didn't know where to start with that until I started putting a presentation like this together. I might have said things like, recommending this particular product helps somebody with their independence, which then helps them engage in activities that are meaningful to themselves, and that has a social impact. I might have been able to say that. Whether I knew where to find the evidence for that would have been a different question. But when we're actually talking about figures, it's really interesting for us to know, what does the research actually say and what numbers are published? There are far too many pieces of evidence to go through in detail in this session. But I'll be on the Closomat stand straight after this. So if you want to know more about the separate bits of research, come and ask me, and I can send you a separate presentation. But for example, there's research by Keel that talks about confidence and self-efficacy post-adaptation, if the aesthetics are right, for example. There's the World Health Organization document about good housing, which talks about the impact on good adaptations on activities of daily living, and therefore what does that give back to society. But the single bit of research, the single bit of evidence that I'm going to talk about today comes from the Building Research Establishment, BRE. And the reason I'm using that one in particular is because it's valid, so it has integrity in terms of your evidence base. BRE provides central government and other organisations, so the Department for Levelling Up, Housing, and whatever name they're going to turn into tomorrow, they provide that department with empirical data on the value of certain types of spending. So in this particular report that I have up there, it's specific to the spending on housing, improving housing, and housing adaptations. So it's really valid for this audience and for us to start to think about how do we use that kind of evidence to justify what you might have otherwise classed as expensive or high cost items. They provide a large list of adaptations or things that they recommend spending on housing, from damp course to new roofs to, there's a long list. I picked out a few today that I think are the most pertinent, just to try and highlight some of the vast sums that they talk about. One of the hazards that they identify is adaptations on the stairs to reduce falls. So they estimated as part of their research that there were just over 1 million identified hazards on stairs, and that the average cost per home to reduce or minimize or take away that risk was £1,242. So that's an average. So that's going to go everything from a grab rail at the bottom of the stairs, a newel rail at the top, to a stair lift, to a home lift. So you've got all that full range. But the average comes down to £1,242 per item. So that's a total cost of £1.3 billion. It's expensive, isn't it? That's a lot of money. It's highly priced. However, they then talk about how cost effective that investment of £1.3 billion would be. They say if that £1.3 billion was invested on those adaptations, the NHS would save £218 million a year after 6 years. So it would take 6 years to get the money back. And then every year after that, the NHS saves £218 million. Social care, they then say, would save £1.7 billion per year after an 8-month period of payback. Is it still expensive? Or is it now cost effective? Because it gives a massive return on investment. Let's just think about that figure again. They're talking about spending £1.3 billion and saving social care £1.7 billion every single year after only 8 months. I can't even get my head around those figures, but I can certainly tell you that that spend of £1.3 billion stops seeming expensive, as does the £1,242 per adaptation. This is falls on the level, so on the flat. They identified just over 400,000 hazards, with an average cost per home to resolve those hazards at £854. So again, anything from probably a grab rail, mobility aid, right through to something like a ground floor wet room to save the person having to use the stairs, for example. So something that you might consider high cost to something that you might have considered to be very low cost, an average of £854. That's a total cost of £350 million. That's a lot of money, isn't it? That's expensive. I'm going to keep saying that just to reinforce it. That's expensive, £350 million. But they then say the NHS would save £104 million per year after 3 years. So it would take 3 years to get that money back. And from then on in, would save £104 million every single year. Social care savings would be £257 million per year after 1.4 years of payback. So that's, quick maths, 17 months-ish. So 17 months of payback and then £257 million a year based on a spend of 350 million. Does the 350 million still look expensive? Or is it now cost effective? Does the £854 now seem expensive? Or is it cost effective? The idea of those last two figures, the NHS and the social care, that's your return on investment. That's what that phrase means. So the return on investment is what you then need to determine makes the adaptation or the product cost effective or not. Clearly, we're delivering this on behalf of Closomat. There is a section there about sanitation and personal hygiene. So we'll go through the same process. They identified just over 17,500 hazards that are toilet-based in a bathroom with an average cost of £743 per resolution. So again, everything from grab rail right up to a wash-dry toilet to something else with an average cost of £743. So that's a total cost of £13 million. £13 million is a lot of money. But they say that would save the NHS £3.6 million a year after 4 years. It would save social care £9.7 million per year after 1.3 years. So the money with this one's come down because the overall spend's down, but we're still talking about £9.7 million saving a year after only 14 months of this spend. So what I'm going to do now, the next slide, is removing some of that cost and assuming that more of them are what you might have previously considered high cost items, luxury items, or items that you would have walked past on the stand. Because that's £743, there are lots of things in this room you don't get for £743. So let's make that real. If we assume that 20% of those hazards that were identified in that last slide were, so 20% were wash-dry toilets. So that would be 3,525 Closomat Palmavita toilets at around £4,000 per unit, which includes installation. So that would be £14 million. Something like a wash-dry toilet might be something you've walked past a stand to think, there might not be any point in me knowing any more about that. I consider that to be a high-cost item. Or it might be a luxury adaptation. So £14 million if 20% needed a wash-dry toilet. 20% are unlikely to need wash-dry toilets, otherwise these guys would be in the Bahamas somewhere. I'm inflating that figure to try and highlight it more for you. I don't want you to think I'm undervaluing, in which case it loses credibility. So I've said 1 in 5 to over-egg it. So that would be £14 million. So if I put the remaining solutions back into that, that's a total spend of £24 million. So even with that 1 in 5 luxury or high cost item, as you maybe would have previously thought, it still saves the NHS £3.6 million a year after 7 years. It still saves the NHS £9.7 million a year after only just over 2 years. So this is an item, or these are items that we might have considered to be high cost, but now are still demonstrating positive return on investment by huge sums in what is, in the context, a very short period of time. However, I'm an OT. I'm not a banker. Those figures are astronomical, I think. I think they're quite eye-opening. They're really interesting, and they should start to challenge us. But actually, as an OT, I don't really care about the money. It's more about what does it do for our client. So the return on investment is not just about the money, it's about the non-tangibles. It's about the social value. So what does it give back? So let's think about toileting, in particular, toileting and dignity. So what does dignity actually mean? Dignity by the SCIE is described as it supports the self-respect of the person, recognizing their capacities and ambitions, and does nothing to undermine it. I've bolded nothing to undermine it there because I think that's a really interesting point. Nothing to undermine it would mean we are going to the lengths of legislation to ensure to maximize independence, if independence is feasible, possible, and the person's goal, to maximize their ability to use the toilet, to be clean, dry, and then to engage socially as we can. It doesn't mean that we stop with the commode in the corner of the room. It doesn't stop with the idea that the best practice would be for us to transfer someone back to bed to be cleaned. It's what is the maximum possible within the legislative guidance. That is the nothing to undermine it. So think about that with dignity in using the toilet. So this certainly is a rhetorical question. I'm not going to ask you to shout that out. I would guess for most people, it's, yes, I've used the toilet in some shape or form today. And that's what you'd expect. For most people, the normal number of times people urinate per day is between 4 and 8 in a 24-hour period. That's what you might consider to be standard. And research, I've used this particular bit of research, but it is the average, but it's highlighted in this particular bit of research. 98% of participants and of the general public tend to open their bowels somewhere between 3 times per week and 3 times per day. That's a huge range, but that's what you need to consider. So if we put that back into the idea that we must be doing everything we can to not undermine dignity, how would you feel if you could only use the toilet 4 times a day? And I'm using 4 times a day as part of what you might consider to be the standard large social care package. So if we've considered both the figures in terms of return on investment in that context, and now we're putting the social value of adaptations into this, think how many times do you use your toilet in a day? And if you were told it could only be 4 times a day, how would that make you feel? And not only that, if it's specific times of the day when other people were there, because that's when you needed to be clean. How would you feel if you couldn't use the toilet at all? And how would you feel if you had to ask for help to wash or dry yourself after using the toilet? So this is a real whistle-stop tour of the concept of return on investment and what we might start to consider as cost-effective adaptations. I think we've certainly started to challenge the idea of what we term to be expensive or high cost. And we've reflected more on what return on investment means, how we can build this factor into our clinical reasoning and start to explore some of the evidence base. The evidence base there that we've started to touch on today and the figures that I've given you, they're not figures that I've just pulled out of thin air. These are published figures that are provided to the Department for Levelling Up and Housing on an annual basis. So you can quote them, you can use them, they are facts. We've explored some of the evidence base, particularly through the BRE, and used this evidence to reflect on the financial and social value of adaptations. And beyond that, we've started to reflect on some of those intangibles, some of those social values. Yes, I use dignity in there, but there are so many others. Those intangibles of social interaction, the research that we know about engagement and meaningful occupation and what that does for somebody's long-term health and well-being. Of course, I'm using something like the toilet as that example, but all of the research, all of these figures, the BRE document, you can transfer into whatever area of work you work in, whatever setting and whatever adaptation you're intending to recommend. I'm going to talk there about that understanding of social value, that understanding about what all of those things bring to somebody's engagement in meaningful occupation and the long-term health and well-being benefits. Again, I would challenge, do we actually know the evidence? Would you know how to quote it? Would you know where to go and get it from if you needed to? We're going to profess to be an evidence-based profession, then we need to also understand and be able to explicitly communicate what that evidence base is. So we really need to start challenging ourselves. And I'm saying this as an OT who needs to challenge himself as to where we find that, where we explore it, and how we start to communicate that effectively with our reports and recommendations. This is a whistle-stop tour. So much research we could have gone into, we just don't have the time for. But I'm happy to talk about it until we get kicked out tonight, if you feel like it. I'm going to be on Closomat stand for the next hour or so on C43, and I'm more than happy to take any questions that you have back there. Thank you.